Great. Well, welcome. Welcome to all of our wonderful Harris Center supporters. It's so great to see so many faces out there. It's really fun. I'm Jeremy Wilson, the director of the Harris Center. And while things may have seemed quiet at the Harris Center building to some of you, our staff and volunteers have been extraordinarily busy this year. Our teacher naturalists have been out working at schools, both in person and remote, and sometimes a little of both. Our trails and lands have been getting more use than we sort of ever anticipated before. Our salamander crossing brigades have just finished up another migration season with record numbers. And our remote events have been so popular that I think we've probably reached many times more people than we do in a normal year. So it's been kind of an extraordinary experience here at the Harris Center. The Harris Center is so lucky to have so many wonderful supporters like you who make all of this possible. So thank you all for all of your incredible generosity. We are so excited about tonight's program with Dr. Robert Goodby. That's in honor of our supporters, and I'm going to turn it over to our Community Program Director, Susie Spickle, now to introduce him.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is so exciting. It's truly my privilege tonight to introduce Bob Goodby. Bob and I were trying to remember when he did his first talk for the Harris Center, and we think it was about 15 years ago, and I will honestly never forget it. Hearing about his work then, as you will hear tonight, will inspire you to look at this landscape differently than you ever did. Bob will give us a glimpse into the lives and ways of people who lived here long before us, thousands of years ago, and he's just the person to do it. He is the professor of anthropology at Franklin Pierce University, and he earned his PhD for anthropology from Brown University. Bob has over 30 years of experience excavating Native American archaeological sites in New England. He is a past president of New Hampshire's Archaeological Society, a former trustee of the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum, and he served on the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs. He has directed over 300 archaeological studies authorized by the National Historic Preservation Act, and his work has appeared in anthropological journals and in anthologies published by the Smithsonian Institution Press and the University Press of New England. He has presented more than 100 talks on his archaeological research for the New Hampshire Humanities to Go program, and every fall he continues to speak to the students at Keene Middle School about the Paleo-Indian Tennant Swamp site, which is right behind their school. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Bob Goodby and buckle your seatbelts because you are about to be blown away. Bob, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, folks. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I have been looking forward to doing this talk for some time, and it has been a great privilege to work with the Harris Center. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I am going to start with a couple of preliminaries. My topic is humans and nature in the Monadnock region, the first 12,000 years. And I want to just say a couple of things about how we understand the relationship between Native Americans and the environment, and then a little about the kind of scientific data that we have that's going to allow me to do this talk this evening. Once I'm done with that, I am then going to look at 4 archaeological sites in the Monadnock region. Each has got its own significance. They're all very different in some ways, and each gives us some insight into that relationship between Native Americans and the natural environment. And then I'll wrap it up by trying to look at some themes that connect all of them. So starting off with the preliminaries. Talking about Native Americans and the environment is actually not as simple as it sounds. It has a complicated and sometimes fraught history. And when non-Native people, particularly Europeans, are talking about Native Americans, we have historically had this sense that in one way or another, they are different, that their connection to nature is not like ours. And this depiction can take all sorts of forms. And one of the gentler forms is the idea of the noble savage that's first coined by the poet John Dryden. But the idea that Native Americans are simple people who are at one with nature and haven't really discovered the evils and ills of complicated society. That, of course, is a stereotype and was created for the purposes of Europeans. And then sort of the flip side of that, again saying that Native people are part of nature, is the really harsh depiction by people like Cotton Mather and even scientists in the 19th century who argued that Native Americans are not fully developed humans. So you see Mather's quote here where he's talking about them as miserable animals. But with that depiction, the idea is, yeah, they're in nature in a way that we are not. Now we can look at those stereotypes and recognize the flaws in them, but they have their legacies and they continue. People in the audience of my vintage, or perhaps a little older, probably remember this from the 1970s. This is a really iconic television commercial campaign to try to get people to stop littering. And it featured a gentleman named Iron Eyes Cody, who sort of stood for the stereotypical Native American, who of course is a Plains Indian, and you see a tear running down his face as people are throwing litter all over the side of the highway. And that didn't really have to be explained. Everybody understood, okay, yeah, Native Americans are one with nature. So they're going to be more upset about littering, and we ought to be more like them. Once again, a stereotype. Things in the real world are much more complicated and much more interesting. Now, in my discipline, archaeology, we have our own history. And beginning in the 1960s, we sort of rediscovered the natural sciences. And we took a real interest in studying how human populations adapt to natural environments. And we began doing something we had never done before, which is we began collaborating with people like biologists to learn more about the natural environment and understand the context that people were living in. And as we did this, we also developed new ways to find that kind of information that would tell us how people are getting the resources, what they're eating, and the way their particular form of adaptation worked. So we moved away from a preoccupation with arrowheads and broken pieces of pottery to an obsession with burned plant remains and things of that sort, and became very, very focused on diet. Now, in doing that, we learned a lot. We learned a lot of things that we didn't know before. But as is often the case, I think the pendulum may have swung too far. And all of our explanations for Native American history became tied to things in the natural environment, in the non-human environment. And in my discipline, that has sort of swung back and forth. And in my 30 years of doing this, I've been part of one of those pendulum swings. But having said that, and I'm going to deal with that in a couple of ways as we go through the talk, but what is the actual evidence we have for how the Native people here adapted to their environment? And we are, by the way, in the southern part of Indokina, which is the traditional homeland of the Abenaki people. One of the things that's an immediate reflection is simply where the sites are. Native American sites are not randomly located. They favored particular settings in the environment that were related to freshwater, transportation, canoe routes, and social networks as well. So just knowing where sites are gives you a sense of how people are using the landscape. And of course, not all sites are equal. Some sites are small temporary camps, others are habitation sites occupied for a longer period of time, and that makes a difference to understanding the relationship with the environment. Another question is seasonality. For almost all of their history in this region, the Native people were what anthropologists call hunters and gatherers. They were getting pretty much all of their food directly from nature in its wild form. There was no real cultivation except for maybe some tobacco. The only domesticated animal was the dog. And given this, they would not live in one place all year round, but they would move from season to season, not nomadically, but they would move strategically, depending on where certain kinds of resources became available. So in the spring, at this time of year, with the spring fish runs, okay, they would be camped at waterfalls and doing a lot of fishing. And in the fall, just like today, a big focus would be hunting. So they'd be in the interior forests, not only hunting deer, but also gathering all the nuts that came down. And over hundreds and thousands of years, these patterns of seasonal movement persisted, changed. And so that's one of the questions we ask as well. Another reflection of that relationship is the kind of tools they used. And we can see these just by the shape of the tools themselves. And we have scientific techniques to look at wear patterns on stone tools so we can tell exactly what kind of material they were used on. So this is a good example right here from Lake Nubanusa in Hancock. To give you a sense of scale, the pestle in this mortar and pestle is about 9 inches long, and the mortar itself, I've lifted this thing and I can just about do it. It's a pretty substantial piece of equipment. And these sorts of things, we tend to find them in strange places. They're not in the habitation sites right on the rivers or the lakes. We tend to find them in what looks like the middle of nowhere. But actually what they are is they're in the middle of groves of nut-bearing trees. So where there are a lot of oaks. And people would come to these places every fall, gather up the nuts, pound them into meal, and no sense in lugging this thing with you. You just leave it there and come back the next year. We have a real problem in terms of our data with preservation. Our soils here tend to be very acidic and most organic things decay very rapidly. So there's a lot that we don't see, things made of wood or fiber, but there are a couple conditions under which things will preserve. And one of them is if they've been burned, not completely, but partially. So if you have plant remains like these charred nutshells, if they're not burned, they're going to decay within a couple of decades. But if they're burned and carbonized, there's still enough of their form left so that an expert can look at them and tell what kind of nuts these came from and give us an insight into diet and also into seasonality, because we know when particular types of nuts are available. And the same sort of thing is true with animal bone. So what happens when a piece of animal bone is in the fire is it becomes what's called calcined. In other words, the organic component of the bone gets burned off, the collagen and that sort of stuff. And what you're left with is the mineral component. And so you find these little pieces of bone that have this sort of chalky white gray appearance, but very often, like in this example, enough of them will preserve so that in the hands of an expert, they can tell what bone it is and what kind of animal it came from. So in this example, this is from a Native American site up in Holderness in the Lakes region. The bone on the left is a caudal vertebra from the tail of a beaver. And the one on the right is a specimen from the lab to give you a sense of that comparison. And on the archaeological one, you can see the cut marks from a stone tool on it. So in that case, we've got good preservation. We can tell what kind of animal it was, and very clearly that it was being used by Native people. And this is what makes up a lot of our data when it comes to understanding that relationship with the natural environment. Now, before I get into my foresights, just a couple of caveats here. Like I said, one of the mistakes we made in the 1960s and 70s was thinking that that nature drove everything about American Indian culture. But it wasn't true. Because while these folks lived in a natural environment and they had ways to adapt to it, they also lived in a social environment. And that social environment was crucial. They had connections to other communities of Native people spanning hundreds and sometimes even thousands of miles. And those were an important factor that shaped their movements and shaped how they survived. So this map of Indian trails from the 1960s, and you can see it in this case centered on the Monadnock region, gives you a sense of these connections. And you have some historic Indian villages here where you have these numbers at Saurus Crossing in Swanzey, down here in Hinsdale, and native people traveled widely, often by canoe or also on foot. And if you look at these maps, another thing you can see is they have a remarkable correspondence to modern highway maps, because they naturally follow the most logical routes to get across this rather difficult landscape. So I take this particular trail every time I go to Concord, and I suspect a lot of you have too. And basically our modern road system is simply an expansion of what had already been there. And not just about resources, but about social connections and social life. And then you also have to think of the land, I think, this is something I've learned, in terms of history, because this was important to all people, it was important to Native people. A number of years ago, I worked on a site up in Holderness, and it was right here on the Squam River, which is a short little river connecting Squam Lake and Little Squam Lake. And we had a nice area of flat, well-drained terrace with a southern exposure right between these two lakes on a river. It was a beautiful setting, the kind that you just know you're going to find a Native American site on. And we did. We found lots of cooking hearths and artifacts, and it showed the site had been occupied for 1,000 years or more. But then something strange happened. At around 2,800, 2,900 years ago, those occupations came to an end. And at the time they came to an end, people began doing something very strange they hadn't done before. Instead of making regular cooking fires with small stones that were full of burned deer bone and nutshells and things like that, they constructed these really large fires with boulders. And there was nothing in them, no food remains, no broken tools. And after this, the site was abandoned. Now, we also discovered human remains at this site. There was the burial of a young woman and the remains of an unknown number of other people. And what seems to have happened is for reasons unknown, this site became a burial ground, became a cemetery around 2,900 years ago. And even though Native people continued to live all over the Lakes region, for the next 2,600 years, nobody lived here. And I think that memory was retained. This is not a place that you live. And so the environment that people inhabit is made up of all of these things. And that's important to keep in mind. Okay, now on to my 4 sites. Okay, the first of them is one of my favorite and one I've talked about quite a bit, the Tennant Swamp site in Keene. I discovered this one in 2009 prior to the construction of the new Keene Middle School. And you can look at the environmental setting. It's the kind that we think of in terms of where native sites might be. There's a nice flat sandy terrace overlooking this enormous wetland. And from the standpoint of hunter-gatherers, a huge wetland like this is the equivalent of a Walmart. It's got all kinds of food. It's got plants, it's got animals, it's got game animals coming to drink, it's got birds, it's got medicinal plants, and we very often find native sites around it. So we thought there might be something there. What we did not expect to find, though, was one of the oldest sites in New England. And as we did our excavation, we found 4 clusters of artifacts, stone tools, and burned animal bone right on the edge of the terrace of Tennant Swamp. And all 4 of them dated to the very first period of human occupation in this area, what archaeologists call the Paleo-Indian period. Okay, it could be as much as 12 or 13,000 years old. And these clusters of artifacts were absolutely pristine. They had never been disturbed. And when we excavated them and mapped all the artifacts in, what we saw was a remarkable pattern. We had oval clusters, right? And this dashed line is sort of encompassing all of the artifacts. And there was structure to these, so that in the very middle, we had burned bone where a fireplace had been. All around it, we had tools and flakes of stone for where people were doing work. And then on the edge of that was a sleeping area marked by this line of stones, showing the position of the tent. And we had 4 of these. dating to the very end of the last glacial advance. An absolutely remarkable site. And it was occupied at a time of extreme climate change, almost comparable to the sort of thing that we're seeing today. And what we think these look like was something like this. So you'd have, this is a historic photograph of Inuit caribou hunters from northern Quebec. But if you have an oval tent covered with caribou hide or some sort of animal skin, people are living in it for a period of time. When they take the tent down and move away, what is going to be left is all of the debris confined by where the walls of that tent were. And so that's what we have at this site. Absolutely a remarkable site. We had over 200 stone tools, the most common of which were these scraping tools that had evidence of, microscopic evidence of having been used to scrape animal hides. And we're able to tell the functions of other tools as well. We learned a lot. When we did the excavation, we worked with a number of natural scientists. One of them was a geologist, Chris Dorian, who was able to reconstruct the environmental setting at the very end of the Pleistocene at the time the site was occupied. And to give the thumbnail sketch of the history here, as you know, all of New England was covered by a huge glacial ice sheet. And that glacier had reached its furthest southern extent about 18,000 years ago. And I want to point something out here. You're going to be seeing this one a lot. Archaeologists talk in years BP, simply means before present. And that's sort of an outgrowth of radiocarbon dating. So all of my dates in this talk are going to be BP. You just think of it as years ago. So 18,000 years ago, that glacier is its furthest south. It's churning away, creating Long Island. And then the climate begins to warm, and that glacier begins to retreat. Its edge begins moving northward. And by 15,000 years ago, almost all of New Hampshire is ice-free. And what is left behind are these huge lakes of meltwater from the glacier. And in the Keene area, there's a sort of a secondary glacial lake called Glacial Lake Ashwellet that goes all the way up toward Marlow. That lake hangs around for maybe 800 or 1,000 years, and then it begins to drain out. And as it does, the water runs down the landscape, follows the path of least resistance, and carves out the valley of the Ashwellet River. And as it does this, you're getting all this deposition, creating deltas. And the setting in Keene, that you can see here, that nice level terrain, is a braided outwash plain from the delta of the glacial lake. And you have 70 meters, about 240 feet of sand on top of the old lake bed, and it's dead flat. And that's the setting that you have here. So Chris is reconstructing all of this for us. The other thing that he found, and this was really remarkable, and I had mentioned climate change. So not only is the climate changing because it's getting warmer, but all of a sudden, okay, at a little after 13,000 years ago, there's a reversal, and it starts getting cold again. It's a period that geologists call the Younger Dryas. And for 1,000 years or more, the weather is just awful. It is cold, it is windy, it's unstable, there's a lot of precipitation. And that's when the first people come into New England. It's during the Younger Dryas. And in the Keene area, what happened was the high winds coming from the northwest during the Younger Dryas, they picked up all this fine sand that had been deposited in the delta. They blow it around, and at our site, there was what Chris called an aeolian mantle, a layer of windblown sand from the Younger Dryas that was right below the topsoil. And that's where all our artifacts were coming from. So there's a direct correlation between the artifacts and this climate event. And we really know quite a bit about the environment that these first people came into. The other thing that Chris discovered, and if you look at the contours of the swamp here, and this is one of the neat things, even if you're just a naturalist and not an archaeologist, archaeology can often give you these details about the history of natural features. But if you look at the topo map up here, the Ashwellet River is way off toward Court Street, okay? And this is all swamp. But what Chris discovered was that at the time the Paleo people were occupying it, the river ran right along this contour line. Okay. And so the Paleo people were living on riverfront property. And that was one of the attractions that drew them here. Okay. That gives us a real sense of the setting here. And then we can look at the artifacts and start to think about how the people living here are adapting. One of the things that was remarkable is that all of the tools were made of stone coming from well over 100 miles away, all from northern New Hampshire and far northern Maine, again, giving you a sense of these social connections. And one of the other things that we were able to get, and this has been difficult, is getting a good radiocarbon date. Paleo-Indian sites in New England don't have the typical cooking hearths with lots of burned wood fragments, which is what we usually date. But about 15 years ago, they developed a technique for dating very minute quantities of burned bone. And using that, we took the bone from one of our houses and got a carbon date of 12,570 to 12,660 years before present. So this is the oldest, there is no older date on a Paleo-Indian site. So as close as we can get right here in the Monadnock region, we are looking at the very first human beings to come into this area. Okay, so quite a site. And some of the bone we were able to get identifications on. We have 3 fragments of caribou bone, which we know was a major resource for the Paleo-Indian people. I work with some top-notch zooarchaeologists who do all this identification. They're down here at the bottom of the screen. And all of the caribou bone that was identified, interestingly, was coming from juveniles or immature caribou. We also had one fragment identified as the pelvis of an otter, right? Which makes sense since we know these people are living on riverfront property. Now, a lot of times when people think about the Paleo-Indians, they think about mammoths and mastodons, and we don't have anything like that here, but you may have caught in the news, this is very exciting, a couple of my colleagues just got a radiocarbon date on a piece of mammoth bone from a museum collection in Vermont. And the bone came from Vermont and was carbon dated 12,700 to 12,800 years ago. So right about the time the Tennant Swamp was occupied. So we know for sure these people saw these animals. They were around at that time. Okay, my second site is the Swanzey Fish Dam. This is a very interesting site. It's in the Ashwillet River, and it is a V-shaped dam made out of cobbles and small boulders that are naturally in the bed of the river. It was seen by the first Europeans here who called it the Old Indian Dam, and you can see a couple of photographs of it there. And the idea was that this dam was used to block or catch migratory fish during the spring fish runs and maybe during the fall. And this was the first site that I worked on when I moved to this area in 2000 and began teaching at Franklin Pierce. We know that there are species, migratory species in the Ashwillet River today that have been there historically. Most of them are members of the herring family, alewives, blueback herring, shad. And then you have a catadromous species. So unlike the anadromous ones that run upstream in the spring to spawn, the catadromous ones go downstream in the fall and out to the ocean. And that's the American eel. And this picture here gives you a sense of, with the alewives, what they look like when they're running. There's a lot of fish, and it was an important resource. Okay? So it's a picture of me and a colleague mapping the dam. And we were able to construct a very accurate map. So rather than a V, it's actually more like a giant check mark. And fish running up the river in the spring would be forced up against the shore where they could be netted or speared. As the eels are coming down in the fall, they'd be caught right at the point of the V there. We had to get some archaeological evidence that proved this thing was actually made by the Native Americans. So I did a lot of survey work with my Franklin Pierce students. And this is a map showing where all our excavations are. I moved a lot of dirt at the site. Okay. and found a lot of artifacts, most of them in the greatest variety right next to the dam. And that included this beautifully decorated pieces of pottery from right about the time of European contact, and stone tools that date back to as much as 5,000 years ago. These ones on the bottom are interesting because for about 40 years, there's been a theory that these aren't spear points, but they're actually knives used for processing fish. You can see how they've been resharpened and they're asymmetrical. And we found these right next to the dam. We also found the remains of fires, presumably used to smoke and dry all the fish that are being caught. We got 2 radiocarbon dates, again with BP meaning years before present. So 3440 and 3600, roughly the same date. And this matches very well with those stone tools. So we know when this dam was built, we know who built it, and we know that it was used continuously for almost 3,500 years. Okay. My third site is in Peterborough. And back in the late 1990s, the Army Corps of Engineers that manages the McDowell Reservoir decided they wanted to know about archaeological sites under their jurisdiction. So they hired a company who did a very minimal level of survey. I mean, just a few pits here, a few pits there. And with that minimal effort, they identified 7 Native American sites within this stretch of the Nubanusett River drainage. We got permission to excavate one of these, this one up here, the Raft Bridge site in 2007. And it's in a wonderful environmental setting. And I think Native Americans did this a lot. They really liked ecotones where different environmental zones converge. And so with a site right here, you've got access to the interior forest. You're right on the Nubanusett, which is navigable by canoe. And right to the east is a huge area of wetlands with all of those resources. We excavated all over the knoll, okay, right next to the river. Here's our excavation plan showing you the setting. Found some pottery sherds dating as far back as 2,000 years ago. Okay, a variety of stone tools, the styles of which we know go back as far as 5,000 years ago. And interestingly, some of them made of materials that are coming from far away, Vermont, northeastern New Hampshire, right on the Maine border around Tamworth and Ossipee, and even in the upper Hudson River Valley. Here's a picture of one of the points from Vermont, absolutely beautifully made, one of the nicest I've ever found, and giving you a sense of the extensive social networks that these people were part of. We also found the remains of a hearth feature, showed up initially as a dark stain with charcoal in it in the soil. When we excavated it, we saw it had this bowl-shaped profile, and we're able to take the burned wood fragments and get a radiocarbon date that put it at about 5,800 years before present. So giving you a sense that this site was occupied repeatedly over at least 4,000 years. The bone itself was really interesting. We had a lot of mammal bone, but the only species that could be identified consistently was beaver. And interestingly, almost all the identified fragments were from the foot bones of the beaver, and most of those were from juveniles. We also had bones of turtle, which preserve well and are easy to identify. And again, interestingly, 3 different species: box turtle, snapping turtle, or painted turtle. And we know historically that catching turtles was something that the Abenaki would have their kids do. Get them out from under your feet and they can have fun and do something useful at the same time. So what kind of site was this? It was not a village site. This is a place where people would come and work, maybe for a day, maybe for an afternoon, and then return somewhere else. But where was that somewhere else? Okay? Looking at a map, if you were to take the Nubanusett downstream, a nice easy canoe, in a fairly short period of time, you'd find yourself right at a nice river confluence on a level piece of land. And I think that's a logical location for a village site. But that's also right now downtown Peterborough. So any trace of that is almost certainly obliterated. Okay. Now, my fourth and final site. This was a really interesting one. This is in Hinsdale in the very southwestern corner of the state. And what we had here was a piece of river terrace that was rapidly eroding into the Connecticut River. And we could look at historic maps and get a sense of what was happening here. This is from 1893. You see Wentastigit Mountain. You see this steep slope, but then in the river, you see these two islands. These two islands were originally connected to the New Hampshire side, and the river ran to the west. But then the river breaks through, creates this channel, and turns them into islands. We know that because the soil type on the islands matches the soil on the New Hampshire side and not on the Vermont side. By the time you get up to modern times, the islands are almost completely gone. What we are excavating is that last little remnant of this big terrace that is clinging to the side of Wentastigit Mountain. And you can see in our excavation here, the site just toppling into the river as we're doing our work. This is one of these sites that, because of flood soil deposits, was deeply buried, and we had many layers of occupation. We found points, arrowheads, spear points, going back at least 5,000 years, and they were arranged in perfect order. The most recent styles were up top, and the older styles were down below. We had 4 radiocarbon dates ranging between 700 years before present and 4,400 years before present, which when you calibrate it comes out to about 5,000 years. And again, in perfect chronological order. So we had layer upon layer upon layer showing 5,000 years of occupation at this site. We had nicely decorated pottery, most of this from the upper portion of the site, because this is a more recent artifact type. We found this beautifully preserved circular stone hearth down at one of the lowest levels, and it's from here that we got a carbon date of 4,400 years before present. Okay. And then we were finding bone. Okay. And the bone was really interesting. Usually what we find are just these nondescript fragments, usually from the shafts of large animals like deer or moose or something of this sort. But these bones were small and they had real form and structure. Almost all of them were vertebra. And when we handed them over to our expert, what we found was that we're seeing a lot of snakes. We had 5 different species of snakes represented: garter snake, water snake, black rat snake, and then really interesting, timber rattlesnake. Okay. And we had quite a bit of this, and we also had one fragment identified as northern copperhead, another deadly venomous snake. And these were not just coming from one animal, because these bones were distributed all throughout the site. Well, it turns out that Wentastigit Mountain is one of the last habitats of the timber rattlesnake in New Hampshire, and historically has been notorious for the number of snakes who lived there. And the native people were coming here and they were hunting them. Right? And because the bones are calcined, we know that they were cooking them. When you take all the snakes together, okay, it can show you that they're going, we found them down almost to a meter, even deeper than that hearth that was almost 5,000 years old. Okay, so coming from a lot of different animals. So this is not an accident. People are coming here over and over and over again for thousands of years, and part of what they're doing here is hunting these animals. But again, you're left with a question. Okay? Can you interpret this just in natural terms or cultural terms? Well, if you look at Native American cultures, you learn that rattlesnakes are sacred animals. And that's true for cultures all across North America. In fact, there's a site in northwestern Vermont, a remarkable site. It's a cemetery site where one of the burials was of a middle-aged man who was buried with a leather bag, and inside the leather bag were the completely articulated skeletons of a timber rattlesnake and a black rat snake. And archaeologists have interpreted this to be a medicine bag. So was this just food, or was it something sacred? Or could it have been both? Maybe that line that we draw between those things is more an artifact of Western culture and not something that would have been understood as Native Americans. But this kind of data can lead you to that question and lead you to appreciating how complex these cultures were. Okay. Conclusion, just a couple of things to sort of sum up. When you look at the archaeology here, there is a long record of continuous occupation, almost 13,000 years, and a very dynamic relationship with the natural environment. Things change. Adaptations change, people's behavior changes, people's understanding of things changes. But there's little or no evidence for anything like population collapse or immigration or famine or environmental catastrophe. The real record here is one of sustainability and stability. I think in part because populations were kept low. Okay? The archaeology gives us a unique set of data for anyone interested in the natural environment. So people who are managing modern wild animal populations, plant populations, forest communities, I think we're producing data here that can be of use to everyone. So it's nice to be able to return the favor to you folks. And then finally, the native people here lived in a world that was both a natural world and a social world. And it was a complicated one. And the archaeology only gives us an insight into some parts of that. And we have to use other sorts of things to begin to fill in those gaps. So thank you. That is my talk. And I'd be happy to take any questions. And I think Lisa's going to be handling that part of it.
Yes, well, thank you so much. Lots of questions, great information. Thank you.
Okay.
I think we'll start with a question from Jerry and Marlene, which is how and when did these people die? Which is a very interesting question, I think, given where we are today.
Yeah, you mean in terms of if just sort of their life cycle and that sort of thing? We have very limited evidence about that. There are not a lot of human burials that have been excavated that would give us the answers to that sort of thing. And because of the nature of our relationship with Native Americans, today archaeologists going to work on a site, the last thing in the world we want to find are human remains. What we do know is that by and large, Native Americans were well nourished. And like all people in the pre-industrial world, there were very high rates of infant mortality and childhood mortality. But if you could get beyond that, it was very common for people to live into their 60s or 70s or even a little older than that. Okay. Yep.
A little nuance to the question, though.
Sure.
Did they cease to exist?
Oh, okay. That's a very good question too. And I just heard all my Abenaki friends in the background saying, heck no. There is the notion that the Native people all died off or moved to Quebec or something like that, but not at all. And the story of their survival in the historic period is a very dramatic one. It involves enduring a lot of discrimination, some real atrocities, surviving in part by hiding their identity, but the Abenaki are very much still with us. So, yeah.
Thank you. From Tia, how far down do you typically have to dig to find these artifacts?
Another good question. It really depends. Most places, not far at all, because most of New England, we don't have a lot of soil accumulation. And for all of you, unless you live on a river that floods, you go out into your yard and you dig a hole, you go through a little bit of topsoil, and then you hit this crunchy, rocky, sandy stuff that the glacier left behind 15,000 years ago. And so typically our sites are all within the first foot or two below ground surface. It's only on a river terrace like the one in Hinsdale at Wentastic Mountain that you'll find deeply buried materials. And then they can be as much as 6 or 7 or 8 feet deep.
Thank you. Well, Dave asks, with the work being done on the bridge in Peterborough in the middle of town, are the workers clued into the history and are they excavating carefully? Because it seems like, how do you know? And next to a river is probably like a good bet that maybe that's a site.
That's a good question, and funny you should ask that question. Actually, every time there's a highway project like that, because they all involve federal funds, and so the National Historic Preservation Act requires that before they do construction, they do an archaeological survey to make sure that nothing is going to be disturbed. And I know that there was a survey done for that project because I did it well before the construction started. So we looked at the setting, and it was would have been a nice one for Native Americans, but there's been so much development there that there's nothing left intact. So yeah, that in that case, that was done. Oh.
Great. Krista asked, why would the tail of beaver have been cut, and how would that bone have been used?
Yeah, good question. And I'm not sure I completely understand it. The one thing I have read about beaver, do not know from personal experience, is it's not particularly tasty. It was not favored. It could be eaten, but was not a favorite food by any stretch. But beaver pelts are very good, okay, for making clothes, making shoes, things of that sort. And Native people also use beaver incisors because, go figure, they make really good woodworking tools.
Mm.
Uh, and so detaching the tail from the beaver, my guess would be it was part of skinning the animal.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Miles asked, what was the relationship with the dogs? What were those dogs like? Is it similar to what it is
No.
today, or?
And partly speculating here, I think it was a little different. Okay, we know that dogs have lived with people. Our relationship goes back tens of thousands of years, and it's almost certain that the very first people to come into the Americas brought dogs with them. Initially, I think the dogs sort of lived on the periphery of the camp, and they would eat a lot of the garbage that the people were throwing away. They'd scavenge, they'd do a little hunting. So they weren't fully domesticated, completely provided for by humans. There's no real evidence that there was any selective breeding of the dogs going on. So I think a lot of times if we saw them, we'd say, it looks like a mutt. Okay? The skeletons of dogs we found say that they're sort of small to medium sized animals.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Here are two somewhat perhaps related questions, so I'll ask them at the same time. Tricia asks, is there evidence of cooperation between peoples that lived in the different sites? And Russ wants to know if there were any predators on humans that early Native Americans had to worry about for their own safety.
Yeah, good question. Let me take the second one first. There's no real evidence of predators. I mean, there certainly would have been dangerous animals. Wolves, right? Certainly would have been potentially dangerous for people. You certainly would want to know not to bother a bear cub in the spring, and things of that sort. But I think people pretty much had that under control. At the end of the Pleistocene, there may have been some large-bodied predators that were a little more formidable, but for the most part, no. As far as the cooperation, yeah, absolutely. The one thing that's striking about the native cultures in New England, and we see this in modern times, we see this in the history, and you can see it in the archaeology. There are connections that tie all of these groups together. These groups were related to each other. They spoke mutually intelligible dialects. They would travel and meet with each other. So, in the 1670s during King Philip's War, you have people from southern New England, from the Narragansett and the Wampanoag, who are fleeing the war, and they come up and they take refuge with their cousins in the Ashwillet River around Keene, New Hampshire. And I think those kinds of networks go back a long time. We have, and I don't mean to paint a picture of an idyllic life, because it wasn't, but we have no good evidence in New England from the archaeology of warfare. We don't see sites being located in defensible locations. There's almost no evidence of skeletons with trauma that looks like it's from war or something like that. So I think the rule was integration, cooperation, and close ties.
Mhm. Thank you. Bridget asks, was moose part of their diet?
It was. Yep, absolutely. And moose hunting, you know, just like today, moose hunting requires a slightly different strategy from other sorts of animals. But yes, moose were definitely hunted. We rarely find the remains on sites. We find deer all the time. And it may be a situation like today where the deer were just more numerous, and bagging a moose was really an exceptional thing. One of the things the Abenaki are known for is they came up with an ingenious moose decoy, which is basically a cone made of bark. And they would go to the marshy areas that moose favored, fill the cone with water, and let it dribble out. And it emulated the sound of a moose urinating. And that, for some reason, would draw the moose. And so they had very long-standing strategies for doing that sort of thing.
Bob, you must be a lot of fun at a cocktail party.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
might be the last question, although we have more, but I think we're running out of time. So I think this is a good one to end up on, because I think we're all wondering if we should go get our shovels and start digging up our backyards. Sam asks, what is the chance that if you dug around Nubanusset Lake or in the woods randomly, you could come upon native relics?
Randomly, probably pretty low, okay, for a couple of reasons. You know, where they settled wasn't random, so you'd want to be looking for certain kinds of environmental settings. But the other problem would be, unless you've had a little training in this business, you might miss some of the telltale signs. One of the most common artifacts we find are the little chips of stone that are left behind from tool making. And to the untrained eye, they don't look like much. With a little bit of experience, you can recognize them right away. If anyone is interested in doing archaeology, it's crucial that you get trained, that you do it right. Every time we dig a site, we destroy it. We're taking it apart, and there's no putting it back. And so you want to make sure it's done the right way and done systematically. The state of New Hampshire actually has a wonderful program that I got my start in archaeology years and years ago. It's called the SCRAP program. Stands for the State Conservation Rescue Archaeology Plan. And if you Google NH SCRAP, it'll take you to it. But what they do is they take people with an interest in archaeology and they train them, working with the state archaeologists, on actual Native American or historic sites. So anyone who's interested in that, that's where I'd steer them. And then what you can do is you can then become a steward of the archaeology that's in this particular area.
Wow, terrific. Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to bring back Jeremy in a minute, but I just want to personally thank you, Bob, for a great talk, and all the supporters in this Zoom event for being such great supporters of the Harris Center and the work that is being done at the Harris Center. So thank you so much. And now let's bring Jeremy back on screen here.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bob. That was great. And it's just every time I hear what you're talking about, it's remarkable. And since I've been, well, going this is a second, we've been working together more closely recently. And every time I go into the woods, I think back on this. And I think you said this in one of our early conversations in the spring, that yeah, Europeans have, 6 generations in this region, but the Native Americans have 400 generations
400, yes.
prior to that.
Yep.
And it's just these levels of history that are on top of each other that just make this region even more incredible than it already was, to know that all of this has happened here. So thank you so much for your talk tonight. We're so excited that Dr. Goodby has written a book that goes into more detail about all that you've heard tonight. This work represents 21 years of archaeological scholarship in the Monadnock region. A partnership between Dr. Goodby, the Harris Center, and the Historical Society of Cheshire County has allowed this book to be published. The publisher is going to be Peter E. Randall Publishing, and it's due to be released in October of 2021. I think October 11th to be exact. The Harris Center's contribution to this effort was made possible through our 50th fund. So once again, thank you to all of our incredible supporters who made the 50th fund such a success for the Harris Center. And you can pre-order a copy of this book on our website. I'm going to share my screen a second to just give you a sense of how to get to that. So if you go to either About Us and go to Shop in the drop-down menu, or under the 50th, there's also a Shop in the drop-down menu. You'll see that there's books and calendars available. And the title of the book is A Deep Presence, 13,000 Years of Native American History. And again, it's coming out in October, and that's where you can order it. So I guess with that, we'll end up the evening. Thank you so much to everybody who made it here tonight. And thank you to Dr. Robert Goodby for such an extraordinary talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Well, hopefully next time that we have you will be an in-person event. So
Yes, it will be. Yep.
terrific. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend.